The last crimson rays of the setting sun painted the Montana Territory sky as Lillian Hayes stumbled through the tall prairie grass, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The year was 1875, and she had been walking for nearly 2 days, her once fine boots worn through at the soles, her blue calico dress stained with dust and sweat. Behind her lay the suffocating confines of her uncle's home in Helena, where she'd endured 5 years of being reminded daily that she was nothing but a burden and unwanted niece taken in after her parents' death from fever, useful only for the endless chores they piled upon her shoulders. Lillian's legs finally gave out, and she collapsed into the waving grasses, her stomach cramped with hunger, and her parched lips cracked as she tried to wet them with her tongue. 20 years old and alone in the wilderness, she wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. Perhaps dying slowly under her aunt and uncle's contempt would have been better than dying quickly out here in the wild. The sound of hoofbeats made her freeze. Riders. Her heart pounded against her ribs as she pressed herself flat against the earth. If it was her uncle's men, they would drag her back to a fate worse than before he had threatened to marry her off to the elderly shopkeeper who had been eyeing her for months. The hoofbeats slowed, and Lillian held her breath. Through the grass, she could see a pair of horses stop just yards away from her hiding spot. "Tracks lead this way," a deep voice said. "Someone on foot, don't look like a man's boots." "Check the grass," another voice replied. "Might be injured." Lillian's heart thundered in her ears. She had no strength left to run. As the grass parted above her, she looked up into the sun-browned face of a man in his early 30s, his features shadowed by a wide-brimmed hat. His expression shifted from curiosity to concern as he took in her disheveled appearance. "Miss," he called softly. "Are you hurt?" Lillian tried to scramble backward, but her exhausted limbs refused to cooperate. "Please," she whispered, "I cannot go back." The man crouched down, keeping a respectful distance. His eyes were a startling shade of blue against his tanned skin. "I am not taking you anywhere you don't want to go," he said gently. "My name is Gabriel Reed. My ranch is about 2 miles from here. You look like you could use some water and food." Lillian stared at him suspiciously. Her uncle had warned her about the dangers that awaited young women alone in the territories. But the kindness in this stranger's eyes stirred something in her, a fragile hope. The second rider approached, an older man with a silver-streaked beard. "Everything all right, Gabe?" Gabriel nodded without taking his eyes off Lillian. "Found a lady in need of assistance, Frank." He reached slowly into his saddlebag and pulled out a canteen, offering it to her. "Water. Take it slow." Lillian's thirst overcame her fear. She accepted the canteen with trembling hands and took a careful sip. The cool water was the sweetest thing she had ever tasted. "What's your name, miss?" Gabriel asked as she drank. "Lillian," she replied after a moment's hesitation. "Lillian Hayes." "Well, Miss Hayes, night's coming, and these plains get mighty cold after dark. I can offer you shelter at my ranch, food, and a safe place to rest. No questions asked until you're ready." He stood and extended his hand. "What do you say?" Lillian looked from Gabriel's face to his outstretched hand. She had no reason to trust this man, yet something told her she could. And what choice did she have? Die alone in the wilderness or take a chance on kindness? She placed her hand in his. His palm was calloused but warm, and his grip was gentle as he helped her to her feet. "You can ride with me," Gabriel said, leading her to his chestnut stallion. "Thunder here is gentle as a lamb." With surprising strength, he lifted her onto the saddle and then swung up behind her. Lillian stiffened at the proximity, but the warmth of his body against the evening chill was comforting. "Hold on," he murmured, and she gripped the saddle horn as they set off across the prairie. As they rode, Lillian's exhaustion caught up with her. She found herself leaning back against Gabriel's chest, her eyelids growing heavy. The steady rhythm of the horse's gait and the security of the arm around her waist lulled her into a state between wakefulness and sleep. Nearly there, Gabriel's voice rumbled near her ear, rousing her. In the fading light, she could make out a collection of buildings nestled in a shallow valley. A substantial log house, a large barn, and several smaller structures. As they approached, dogs began to bark, and a woman emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. Gabriel brought the horse to a stop in the yard. "Nancy," he called to the woman, "we have a guest who needs looking after." The woman hurried forward as Gabriel dismounted and reached up to help Lillian down. Her legs buckled as her feet touched the ground, and Gabriel caught her before she could fall. "Poor thing's dead on her feet," Nancy said, her round face creased with concern. She was in her 50s, with gray-streaked brown hair pulled back in a practical bun. "Bring her inside, Gabe. I'll heat some soup." Gabriel lifted Lillian into his arms as if she weighed nothing, carrying her toward the house. "You're safe now," he said quietly. "You can rest." As they entered the warm, lamp-lit interior of the ranch house, Lillian caught the scent of fresh bread and wood smoke. Gabriel set her down gently in a chair by the hearth, and Nancy bustled about, bringing a blanket to wrap around her shoulders. "Thank you," Lillian whispered, overwhelmed by their kindness. "I don't know how I'll repay you." Gabriel shook his head. "No need for that talk now. Out here, we help folks who need it. That's the way of things." He removed his hat, revealing thick, dark hair with a slight wave to it. "You're welcome to stay as long as you need." As Lillian looked into his earnest face, something broke loose inside her, the tight knot of fear she had been carrying for days, for years. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and she covered her face with her hands. "I'm sorry," she gasped between sobs. Now, Nancy soothed, putting an arm around her shoulders. "You just let it out, child. Then we'll get some food in you and find you a bed. Everything looks brighter in the morning." Gabriel stood awkwardly for a moment, then nodded. "I'll see to the horses," he said, and stepped outside, giving Lillian privacy for her tears. That night, after a simple but hearty meal of bean soup and fresh bread, Lillian slept in a small but clean bedroom that Nancy told her belonged to Gabriel's sister when she visited from St. Louis. The bed was soft, the quilts warm, and for the first time in years, Lillian felt safe as she drifted into a dreamless sleep. Morning came with the crowing of roosters and the distant lowing of cattle. Lillian opened her eyes to sunlight streaming through a curtained window. For a moment, she was disoriented, then remembered where she was and how she had come to be there. She sat up, noticing that someone had left a pile of folded clothes on the chair by the bed. A note on top read, "These belong to Gabe's sister. Should fit well enough until we can wash yours." Nancy Lillian dressed in the simple blue skirt and white blouse, grateful for the clean clothes. She combed her fingers through her long brown hair, wishing for a proper brush, and then made her way to the main room of the house. Nancy was at the stove, cooking breakfast. She turned with a smile when Lillian entered. "Good morning, dear. You look much better after some rest. Come, sit and have some coffee. The men will be in soon for breakfast." Lillian helped set the table, and soon Gabriel and Frank, along with 2 other ranch hands, came in from the morning chores. Gabriel's eyes found hers immediately, and his face brightened with a smile that made her heart beat a little faster. "Miss Hayes," he said, removing his hat. "I hope you slept well." "Very well, thank you, Mr. Reed," she replied, surprised by the shyness in her voice. "And please call me Lillian." "Lillian," he repeated, as if testing the name. "Then you must call me Gabriel." Over breakfast, Gabriel explained that the Double R Ranch had been his father's, passed down to him 5 years ago when the older Reed had decided to retire to a warmer climate. The ranch raised cattle and horses, with about 20 hands working during the busy seasons. Nancy here has been keeping us all fed and the house in order since I was a boy, Gabriel said with obvious affection for the older woman. She's the closest thing to a mother most of us have out here. Nancy waved away the compliment. Someone has to make sure these men don't live like wild animals. She turned to Lillian. Now, dear, whenever you're ready, you can tell us what brought you out to the middle of nowhere all alone. But no rush. Lillian took a deep breath. These people had been nothing but kind to her. They deserved the truth. I ran away, she began, staring down at her coffee cup, from my uncle's home in Helena. After my parents died from fever when I was 15, he took me in, but I was never welcome there. My aunt resented the extra work and my uncle, she faltered. He made it clear I was a burden they bore only out of family obligation. Gabriel's jaw tightened, but he remained silent, letting her continue. 2 days ago, my uncle announced he had arranged a marriage for me to Mr. Winters, the mercantile owner. He's 63 years old and has buried 3 wives already. Lillian's voice trembled. When I refused, my uncle told me I had no choice, that I owed them for years of room and board. He locked me in my room until the wedding could be arranged. I climbed out the window that night with only what I could carry and just walked. I didn't know where I was going. Nancy made a sympathetic sound, and Frank muttered something under his breath about no way to treat kin. Gabriel leaned forward, his eyes intent on Lillian's face. No one will force you to marry anyone here, Lillian. You have my word on that. You're welcome to stay as long as you need to figure out what you want to do next. Relief washed over her. I can work, she said quickly. I can cook and clean and sew. I won't be a burden to you. Something flickered in Gabriel's eyes at her words. You're not a burden, he said firmly. You belong here as long as you want to stay. Those simple words, "you belong here," struck Lillian like a physical blow. How long had it been since she had belonged anywhere? Thank you, she whispered, unable to say more past the tightness in her throat. Nancy patted her hand. Well, that's settled then. And if you really want to help out, I wouldn't mind an extra pair of hands around the house. Gets to be a lot, looking after all these men. The days that followed fell into a pleasant rhythm. Lillian helped Nancy with the cooking and household chores, grateful for the older woman's patient teaching when she encountered unfamiliar tasks. The ranch was far larger and more complex than her uncle's modest townhouse, with a constant flow of activity from dawn until dusk. Gabriel was often out from sunrise until late afternoon, overseeing the ranch operations, but he always made a point to speak with Lillian when he returned. Sometimes it was just a brief exchange, asking about her day or telling her something interesting he had seen on the range. Other times, when his work allowed, they would sit on the porch after supper, watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in spectacular colors. During these quiet conversations, Lillian learned about Gabriel's life. He had been born on the ranch, the middle child between an older brother who had died in the Civil War and a younger sister who had married a banker in St. Louis. He had briefly attended school back east, but had returned when his father needed him to help run the ranch. I never felt right in the city, he confessed one evening, his profile outlined in gold by the setting sun. Too many people, too many buildings. Out here, a man can breathe. Lillian understood that feeling. Even in Helena, which was small compared to the eastern cities, she had often felt confined. Here on the ranch, with the vast sky overhead and the rolling prairie stretching to the horizon, she felt something she hadn't experienced in years: freedom. As the days passed, Lillian began to notice the small kindnesses Gabriel showed her. A wildflower left by her plate at breakfast, a book from his modest library that he thought she might enjoy, the way he always made sure she had the most comfortable chair by the fire in the evenings. She also noticed other things: the breadth of his shoulders, the grace with which he moved despite his size, the way his eyes crinkled at the corners when he smiled, which was often when he looked at her. She found herself watching for his return each day, her heart beating a little faster when she caught sight of him riding toward the house. One afternoon, about 3 weeks after her arrival, Lillian was hanging laundry on the line behind the house when she heard hoofbeats approaching. Expecting to see Gabriel or one of the ranch hands, she was startled to see a stranger riding into the yard, a well-dressed man on an expensive-looking horse. The man spotted her and tipped his hat. "Good afternoon, miss. Is Mr. Reed available?" "He's out checking the north pasture," Lillian replied cautiously. "He should return soon. May I tell him who's calling?" The man dismounted with practiced ease. "Lawrence Blackwood of the Montana Land and Cattle Company." He smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. "And you are?" "Lillian Hayes. I'm helping Mrs. Donovan with the household." She wasn't sure how else to describe her position at the ranch. "I see." Blackwood's gaze swept over her in a way that made her uncomfortable. "Perhaps I'll wait for Mr. Reed inside." Before Lillian could respond, Nancy appeared at the back door. "Mr. Blackwood," she said, her usual warmth noticeably absent. "What brings you out this way again?" "Business with Mr. Reed, Mrs. Donovan. Nothing for you to concern yourself with." Nancy's lips thinned. "Well, you can wait in the parlor. I'll bring some coffee." As Blackwood followed Nancy inside, Lillian hurried to finish hanging the laundry. There was something about the man that unsettled her. When she entered the kitchen a few minutes later, Nancy was muttering to herself as she arranged cups on a tray. "Is everything all right?" Lillian asked. Nancy glanced toward the parlor and lowered her voice. "That man has been trying to buy the Double R for nearly a year now. His company is buying up all the small ranches they can. Gabe has told him no 3 times already, but he keeps coming back with higher offers. Why would Gabriel sell? The ranch seems to be doing well." "It is, but it's hard work, and Blackwood offers easy money." Nancy sighed. "Last winter was difficult. We lost a lot of cattle in the blizzards. Gabe had to take out a loan to buy new stock this spring. I know he's worried about making the payments if we have another bad winter." Lillian felt a pang of concern. She had come to love the ranch in her short time there, the open spaces, the simple but satisfying life, the sense of community among the workers. The thought of it all being sold to a company like Blackwood's was distressing. The sound of riders entering the yard interrupted her thoughts. Gabriel had returned with Frank and 2 other hands. Lillian watched through the window as Blackwood emerged onto the porch to greet them. Though she couldn't hear the words, she could see the stiffness in Gabriel's posture as he dismounted and shook the man's hand. The men came inside, and Nancy shooed Lillian upstairs. "Best let them talk business," she said, though Lillian suspected the older woman was trying to keep her away from Blackwood's unsettling gaze. Later that evening, after Blackwood had departed, Gabriel was unusually quiet at supper. When the meal was finished and the dishes cleared, he asked Lillian if she would join him for a walk. The evening was mild, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of prairie flowers. They walked in companionable silence until they reached a small rise overlooking the ranch buildings, golden in the last light of day. "Mr. Blackwood came to make another offer on the ranch," Gabriel said finally, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "Nancy mentioned he's been trying to buy it," Lillian replied carefully. "She seemed to think you would never sell." Gabriel sighed, removing his hat to run a hand through his hair. "A year ago I would have said the same, but things have been difficult lately." The loan I took out has a high interest rate, and if we don't turn a good profit this year—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "Blackwood offered enough to pay off all my debts and leave me with a tidy sum besides." Lillian's heart sank. "What will you do?" "I don't know." He turned to look at her, his eyes troubled. "This land has been in my family for 2 generations. Every tree, every rock, every bend in the creek, it's part of me. The thought of seeing it carved up into sections or turned into some company's asset." He gestured toward the main house. "That house is where I was born, where my mother died, where my father taught me everything I know about ranching and life." Impulsively, Lillian reached out and touched his arm. "Then don't sell. There must be another way." Gabriel covered her hand with his own, his touch sending warmth through her. "I've been thinking about solutions for months. The problem is cash flow. We need more income before the loan comes due in November." "What about selling more horses? Nancy mentioned your stock is well regarded." A smile touched his lips. "You've been paying attention." "Of course I have," Lillian said softly. "This place has become important to me." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a recognition of shared feelings that neither was quite ready to name. Gabriel squeezed her hand gently before releasing it. "You might be onto something about the horses. I've been so focused on the cattle operation that I haven't put enough effort into that side of the business. My father always said our horses could be worth more than our beef if we found the right buyers. The army is always looking for good mounts," Lillian suggested. "My father once mentioned that military contracts were steady business." Gabriel looked at her with newfound respect. "Your father was in the horse trade?" "No, he was a schoolteacher, but he had a friend who supplied horses to the cavalry. He used to talk about it sometimes." Gabriel nodded thoughtfully. "Fort Shaw isn't far. I could ride there next week, see if they're in the market for fresh mounts." His face brightened with renewed hope. "Thank you, Lillian. Sometimes it takes a fresh perspective to see what's been right in front of you all along." The way he looked at her made Lillian wonder if he was still talking about horses. As they walked back to the house in the gathering twilight, Gabriel asked, "Would you like to learn to ride? Properly, I mean. If you're going to stay in Montana, it's an essential skill." Lillian's heart leaped at the casual assumption that she might stay. "I would like that very much." "Good. We'll start tomorrow afternoon if the weather holds." True to his word, Gabriel appeared the next day after lunch, leading a gentle mare with a dappled gray coat. "This is Pepper," he said, stroking the horse's neck. "She's patient with beginners." Lillian approached cautiously. She had ridden occasionally as a child but had little experience with horses since then. The mare regarded her with soft brown eyes, then stretched her neck to sniff at Lillian's hand. "She likes you," Gabriel observed with a smile. "Here, offer her this." He handed Lillian a slice of apple. The mare's velvety lips tickled Lillian's palm as she accepted the treat, making her laugh. The sound seemed to please Gabriel, whose smile widened. "Now, let me show you how to saddle her properly," he said, demonstrating each step carefully. Many accidents happen because of poorly secured saddles. Once Pepper was saddled, Gabriel showed Lillian how to mount, explaining the proper way to hold the reins and sit in the saddle. "Straight back, heels down," he instructed, adjusting her posture with a gentle touch at her shoulder and knee. Lillian was acutely aware of his proximity, the warmth of his hands through the fabric of her dress. When he stepped back to assess her position, she felt both relieved and disappointed. "Perfect," he declared. "Now to move forward, just squeeze gently with your legs. Pepper knows what to do." For the next hour, Gabriel led Lillian around the corral, teaching her the basics of controlling the horse with reins and leg pressure. By the end of the lesson, she was able to walk and stop the mare on her own, a small accomplishment that filled her with disproportionate pride. "You're a natural," Gabriel told her as he helped her dismount. His hands lingered at her waist a moment longer than necessary, and when she looked up, his face was closer than she expected. For a heartbeat, she thought he might kiss her, but then he stepped back, clearing his throat. "Same time tomorrow?" he asked, his voice slightly rough. "I'd like that," Lillian replied, her cheeks warm. The riding lessons became a daily ritual. Gabriel was a patient teacher and Lillian proved to be an eager student. Within a week, she was confident enough to ride Pepper at a trot. And by the end of the second week, Gabriel declared her ready for a short trail ride beyond the confines of the corral. They set out early one morning when the dew still sparkled on the grass and the air was crisp with the promise of a warm day to come. Gabriel rode Thunder, keeping pace with Lillian's more sedate mount. He led her along a winding creek that bordered the eastern edge of the ranch property, pointing out landmarks and sharing stories about growing up in this wild, beautiful country. "My brother and I used to fish in this pool," he said, as they passed a deep bend in the creek. "We'd stay out all day sometimes, come home sunburned and hungry but happy." "You must miss him," Lillian said softly. Gabriel nodded. "Every day. Adam was 4 years older, always looking out for me. When the war came, he joined up right away, said it was his duty. We got word of his death at Gettysburg a year later." He was silent for a moment. "He never got to see what the ranch has become. I like to think he'd be proud." "I'm sure he would be," Lillian said. "You've built something remarkable here." Gabriel gave her a grateful look. "What about your family? You've told me about your parents, but did you have siblings?" "No, I was an only child. My mother had several miscarriages before and after me. The doctor told her I was her miracle." Lillian's voice softened with memory. "She used to say that God gave her exactly the child she was meant to have." "She sounds like a wise woman." "She was. She taught at the girls' school where my father was headmaster. They both loved books and learning. Our house was full of literature, poetry, discussions about ideas." Lillian smiled at the recollection. "My uncle thought it was a frivolous way to raise a child, especially a girl. When I came to live with them, most of my books were left behind or sold." Anger flashed across Gabriel's face. "Your uncle sounds like a fool," he said bluntly. Lillian was startled into laughter. "He is, rather, but I managed to save a few treasured volumes. They're in my bag, the only things I brought with me besides clothes." "What books did you save?" Gabriel asked, guiding Thunder around a rocky outcropping. "Shakespeare's sonnets, a collection of Wordsworth's poetry, and my mother's copy of Pride and Prejudice." Lillian felt suddenly self-conscious. "I know they're not practical choices for a runaway." "I think they're perfect choices," Gabriel replied. "They're pieces of your heart." His understanding touched her deeply. "Yes, that's exactly it." They rode in companionable silence for a while, following the creek as it curved through a small stand of cottonwood trees. The leaves rustled softly overhead, casting dappled shadows on the ground. "Up ahead is my favorite spot on the whole ranch," Gabriel said, pointing to a clearing beyond the trees. "I thought we could stop there for a bit." The clearing opened onto a spectacular view of the valley below, with the ranch buildings visible in the distance and mountains rising blue on the horizon. A large flat rock provided a natural seat overlooking the panorama. They dismounted, and Gabriel spread a small blanket on the rock's surface. From his saddlebag, he produced a parcel wrapped in cloth. "Nancy packed us some food," he explained, unwrapping bread, cheese, and apples. "She seemed to think we might get hungry." Lillian smiled, suspecting that Nancy's motives weren't entirely related to their potential hunger. The older woman had taken to making knowing comments whenever Gabriel was particularly attentive to Lillian. They sat side by side on the rock, sharing the simple meal and the magnificent view. The breeze carried the scent of wildflowers and sun-warmed grass, and birds called to one another from the trees behind them. "I can see why this is your favorite place," Lillian said, breaking the comfortable silence. "It feels like you can see forever from here." Gabriel nodded, his gaze sweeping over the landscape. "When I have decisions to make or problems to solve, I come here to think. Somehow, looking at all this space puts things in perspective." "And have you made any decisions about Mr. Blackwood's offer?" Lillian asked hesitantly. "I'm riding to Fort Shaw the day after tomorrow to inquire about a horse contract," Gabriel replied. "If that works out, I won't have to consider selling." He turned to look at her directly. "But even if it doesn't, I've decided the Double R isn't for sale. This land is my heritage and my future. I won't give it up without a fight." The determination in his voice stirred something in Lillian. In the month she had known him, she had come to admire Gabriel's quiet strength, his integrity, and his kindness. Now, seeing the passion with which he defended his home, she realized her feelings had deepened into something far more powerful than admiration. "I'm glad," she said simply. Meeting his gaze, Gabriel's eyes searched her face. "Lillian," he began, his voice low, "I want you to know that whatever happens with the ranch, you have a place here for as long as you want it. These past weeks with you have been—" He paused, seeming to search for the right words. "You've brought something to the Double R that was missing." A light, a warmth. Lillian's heart quickened. The distant sound of a gunshot cut her off, followed by the unmistakable crack of a rifle. Gabriel was on his feet instantly, his body tense. "That came from the direction of the ranch," he said, his voice sharp with concern. "We need to get back." All thoughts of tender confessions forgotten, they quickly packed up the remains of their meal and mounted their horses. Gabriel led the way at a pace faster than Lillian had ridden before, but Pepper seemed to sense the urgency and followed Thunder without hesitation. As they emerged from the trees and gained a clearer view of the ranch, Gabriel reined in abruptly. Lillian pulled up beside him, following his gaze to where a plume of dark smoke rose from one of the outbuildings. "The hay barn," Gabriel said grimly. "Someone set it on fire." Without another word, he kicked Thunder into a gallop, leaving Lillian to follow as best she could. By the time they reached the ranch yard, chaos reigned. Men formed a bucket brigade from the well to the burning barn, while others tried to lead frightened horses from the nearby corral to safety. The acrid smell of smoke filled the air, along with the crackle of flames and the shouts of the ranch hands. Gabriel leaped from Thunder's back before the horse had fully stopped, tossing the reins to a young stable boy. "What happened?" he demanded of Frank, who was directing the firefighting efforts. "3 riders," Frank reported tersely. "Shot in the air to scatter the men, then threw torches into the hay barn, rode off toward the east." Gabriel's face darkened with anger. "Anyone hurt?" "No, but we'll lose the barn and all the winter hay if we can't get this under control." "The creek," Lillian said suddenly, dismounting with less grace than Gabriel but managing to keep her feet. "Could we divert water from the creek? It's not far." Frank looked at her with newfound respect. "Might work. If we dam it upstream and break the bank near the barn, we could flood this whole area." Gabriel nodded sharply. "Do it. Take 4 men and whatever tools you need." He turned to another ranch hand. "Jim, get the rest of the horses to the north pasture away from the smoke." For the next hour, Lillian worked alongside Nancy and the cook, bringing water and food to the men fighting the fire. The creek diversion worked better than expected, sending a rush of water into the yard that helped contain the flames to the barn alone. By late afternoon, the fire was out, though the barn was a charred ruin. Exhausted and smoke-stained, Gabriel found Lillian as she was distributing cups of water to the tired men. His face was streaked with soot, his eyes red from the smoke, but his relief at seeing her was evident. "Are you all right?" he asked, taking her hands in his as if to reassure himself she was unharmed. "I'm fine," she assured him. "Just worried about everyone else. Was anyone hurt? Minor burns and smoke, nothing serious." His expression hardened. "But we lost all the winter hay and part of the barn. Rebuilding will take time and money we can't spare right now." Lillian squeezed his hands. "Who would do this?" Gabriel's jaw tightened. "I have my suspicions." He glanced around to ensure they weren't overheard. "Blackwood's company has a reputation for playing rough with ranchers who won't sell. Nothing that can be proven in court, of course." "Surely he wouldn't he? The fire damages us financially, makes it harder to refuse his next offer." Gabriel released her hands with a sigh. "I need to talk to the men, see if anyone recognized the riders." Lillian watched him walk away, her heart heavy with concern. The attack on the ranch had revealed the precariousness of Gabriel's situation and, by extension, her own. If he was forced to sell, what would become of her tenuous place here? That evening, the mood at supper was subdued. The men were tired from fighting the fire, and Gabriel was preoccupied with plans for rebuilding the barn. When the meal was finished, he announced that he would still ride to Fort Shaw as planned. "We need that horse contract more than ever now," he told Frank. "I'll leave at first light and push hard. Should make it there by nightfall, conduct business the next day, and be back the day after." Lillian found him later on the porch, staring out at the darkness. The smell of smoke still hung in the air, a reminder of the day's events. "I wish you didn't have to go," she said softly, coming to stand beside him. Gabriel turned to her, his expression softening. "So do I, especially now." "But without that contract." He didn't need to finish the thought. "I understand." Lillian hesitated, then added, "Please be careful. If Blackwood is behind the fire, he might try to prevent you from reaching Fort Shaw." "I'll take the mountain trail," Gabriel assured her. "It's longer but less traveled, and I'll be armed." He touched her cheek gently. "Try not to worry. Frank and the boys will keep things safe here until I return." Lillian leaned into his touch, drawing comfort from the warmth of his hand. "Earlier today, before we heard the gunshots," she began, "you were about to say something." Gabriel's eyes held hers in the dim light from the house windows. "I was going to tell you that you've come to mean a great deal to me, Lillian Hayes, more than I expected." More than might be proper, given the circumstances. Her heart skipped a beat. "And what circumstances are those? You came here seeking refuge, not attachment to a struggling rancher." Lillian summoned her courage. "Perhaps I've found both." For a moment, Gabriel seemed unable to speak. Then, slowly, he bent his head and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, tentative at first, then deepening as Lillian responded. His arms encircled her waist, drawing her closer, and she placed her hands on his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart beneath her palms. When they finally parted, Gabriel rested his forehead against hers. "I've wanted to do that since the first week you were here," he admitted. Lillian smiled. "Why did you wait so long?" "I didn't want you to think I expected anything in return for helping you. And I wasn't sure if your feelings matched mine." His thumb traced the line of her jaw. "Do they?" "Yes," she whispered. "They do." He kissed her again, more briefly this time, but with no less feeling. "I have to go inside and finish preparations for tomorrow," he said reluctantly. "But we'll talk more when I return. There's much to say." Lillian nodded, stepping back from the circle of his arms. "Be safe," she said, the words carrying all the weight of her newly acknowledged feelings. "I will," he promised. "For you." Gabriel left before dawn the next morning. Lillian rose early to see him off, wrapping a small package of food for his journey. They shared a brief, private moment in the kitchen, a stolen kiss and whispered words of affection before he mounted Thunder and rode away into the lightening sky. The day stretched endlessly without him. Lillian kept busy helping Nancy with household tasks and assisting the men as they cleared the debris from the burned barn. By evening, she was physically exhausted but still restless with worry. She was just preparing for bed when a commotion in the yard drew her to the window. Riders were approaching, 3 of them, moving fast in the moonlight. Her heart leaped with hope that Gabriel had somehow returned early, but as the men came into the circle of light cast by the yard lantern, she saw that none of them was him. Frank met the riders with a rifle cradled in his arms. Words were exchanged, too distant for Lillian to hear, and then Frank turned toward the house, his expression grim. Moments later, Nancy knocked at Lillian's door. "Frank needs to speak with you," the older woman said, her voice tight with concern. "It's about Gabe." Lillian's blood ran cold. She followed Nancy to the kitchen, where Frank stood with his hat in his hands. One of the riders, a young man she recognized as a hand from the neighboring Anderson ranch, waited near the door. "Miss Hayes," Frank began, his weathered face somber, "Ben here was riding back from town when he saw something I think you should know about." The young ranch hand stepped forward nervously. "I was taking a shortcut through Hanson's Gulch," he explained. "Found fresh tracks and signs of a struggle. Then I spotted a horse, a big chestnut stallion with a white blaze." "Thunder," Lillian whispered, her heart sinking. Ben nodded. "No sign of the rider, but—" He hesitated, glancing at Frank. "Tell her all of it, boy," Frank instructed grimly. "There was blood on the rocks," Ben finished. "And this." He held out a familiar object, Gabriel's hat, the brim stained with what could only be blood. Lillian felt the room spin. Nancy guided her to a chair, her comforting hand on Lillian's shoulder. "I'm taking some men out at first light to search," Frank said. "If Gabe's hurt, he couldn't have gone far on foot in that terrain." "I'm coming with you," Lillian said immediately, her voice steadier than she felt. Frank shook his head. "It's no place for a woman, Miss Hayes. The Gulch is rough country." "I don't care," Lillian insisted, rising to her feet. "Gabriel would do the same for any of us. I won't sit here waiting while he might be injured or—" She couldn't bring herself to say the word dying. Nancy intervened. "Frank, you know she's right. And she's a good rider now. Gabe made sure of that. Let her come." The foreman hesitated, then nodded reluctantly. "Be ready to ride at dawn. Wear sturdy clothes and boots if you have them." Sleep was impossible that night. Lillian paced her room, praying that Gabriel was alive, that his injuries weren't severe, that they would find him in time. When the eastern sky finally began to lighten, she was already dressed in her sturdiest skirt and the boots Nancy had found for her hair braided tightly down her back. 6 riders set out as the sun crested the horizon. Frank, Lillian, and 4 of the ranch's most experienced hands. They rode hard toward Hanson's Gulch, a deep ravine cut by an ancient river into the foothills east of the ranch. Ben's directions led them to the site of the apparent ambush, a narrow part of the trail where rocky outcroppings provided perfect cover for an attack. Thunder was gone, presumably having wandered off, but the signs of violence remained. Scuffed earth, a few spent cartridge cases, dark stains on the pale stone. Frank dismounted to examine the ground. 3, maybe 4 men, he reported after studying the tracks. They came up from the gulch, waded behind these rocks. He pointed to footprints leading away from the site. "Looks like they dragged something heavy down that way." Lillian's throat tightened at the implication. "Gabriel," Frank nodded grimly. "Most likely. The tracks are fresh, less than a day old." They left their horses with 1 man and proceeded on foot, following the trail down into the gulch. The descent was steep and treacherous, with loose rocks that slid underfoot and thorny brush that tore at their clothing. Lillian stumbled several times but refused offers of help, determined to keep up with the men. The trail led to a crude camp hidden in a dense thicket at the bottom of the gulch. Signs of recent occupation were evident: a fire pit with warm ashes, discarded food tins, trampled grass, but the camp was deserted. "They've moved on," Frank said, kneeling to touch the ashes. "Not long ago." "But where is Gabriel?" Lillian asked, scanning the area desperately for any sign of him. One of the ranch hands called from the edge of the clearing. "Over here. I found something." They rushed to where the man stood, pointing at a dark opening in the rock face, the entrance to a small cave or mine shaft. A heavy wooden door had been constructed across the opening, secured with a padlock. "Stand back," Frank ordered, drawing his pistol. He fired twice at the lock, the shots echoing through the gulch. The lock broke and two men pulled the door open. The darkness within seemed absolute after the bright sunlight outside. As Lillian's eyes adjusted, she made out a figure slumped against the far wall of the shallow cave. "Gabriel," she cried, pushing past Frank to rush inside. Gabriel's head lifted at the sound of her voice. His face was bruised, a dried stream of blood trailing from a cut at his temple, but his eyes focused on her with recognition. "Lillian," he said hoarsely, as if not trusting his senses. "How?" She fell to her knees beside him, hands hovering over his injuries, afraid to touch and cause more pain. "We found you," she said simply, tears blurring her vision. "Are you badly hurt?" Gabriel attempted to sit up straighter and winced. "Ribs," he explained tersely. "And my leg. They worked me over pretty good before locking me in here." Frank crouched on Gabriel's other side, his face dark with anger as he assessed his friend's condition. "Can you walk if we help you?" "I'll manage," Gabriel said, his jaw set with determination. He looked at Lillian, his eyes softening despite his pain. "You shouldn't have come. It's dangerous." "Of course I came," she replied, finally daring to touch his face, gently wiping away a smudge of dirt. "Did you really think I wouldn't?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "I should have known better." With Frank on one side and another hand on the other, Gabriel was helped to his feet. He sucked in a sharp breath as he put weight on his injured leg but remained upright. The climb back up to the horses was slow and painful, with frequent stops to rest. Lillian stayed close, offering water from her canteen and words of encouragement. When they finally reached the horses, a new problem presented itself. Gabriel couldn't ride alone in his condition. After some discussion, it was decided that he would ride double with Lillian on her mare, as Pepper was the gentlest mount and most likely to carry the extra weight smoothly. The journey back to the ranch was arduous. Gabriel, despite his attempts to hide it, was clearly in significant pain. He sat behind Lillian, his arms around her waist more for stability than affection, his body occasionally tensing against hers when the horse's movements jarred his injuries. "Who did this to you?" Lillian asked during one of their rest stops, as she helped him drink from the canteen. Gabriel's expression hardened. "Blackwood's men. They didn't bother to hide it, said they were teaching me a lesson for being stubborn about the ranch." He coughed, wincing at the pain in his ribs. "They were going to leave me in that cave for a few days to reconsider his offer." Frank, overhearing, spat on the ground. "We should ride to the sheriff in Helena, report this." Gabriel shook his head. "No proof it was Blackwood. His men will claim they were nowhere near here and he'll have witnesses to back them up." His hand found Lillian's, squeezing it gently. "But I'm not beaten. Not even close." It was late afternoon by the time they reached the ranch. Nancy burst from the house at the sound of their approach, her face lighting with relief when she saw Gabriel. "Thank the Lord," she exclaimed, hurrying to help as the men eased Gabriel from the horse. Bring him inside. I've got hot water and bandages ready." The next hours were a flurry of activity as Gabriel's injuries were tended to. His ribs were badly bruised but not broken, according to Jack Wilson, a former Army medic who worked as one of the ranch hands. His leg had a deep cut that required stitching, and the wound on his head, while dramatic in its bleeding, was relatively minor. Throughout the examination and treatment, Lillian stayed by Gabriel's side, holding his hand during the painful stitching of his leg, bathing his face with cool water to ease the swelling of his bruises. When at last he was settled in his bed, wounds dressed and pain eased somewhat by Nancy's herbal remedies, the others withdrew to give them privacy. "You should rest," Lillian told him, smoothing the blanket over his chest. Gabriel caught her hand, bringing it to his lips. "I will. But first, I need to tell you something." His eyes, though tired, were intense as they held hers. "When I was in that cave thinking I might die there, all I could think about was you, that I might never see you again, never tell you." He paused, swallowing hard. "Never tell you that I love you, Lillian Hayes." The words she had longed to hear, spoken in the aftermath of violence and fear, brought tears to her eyes. "I love you too," she whispered, bending to press a gentle kiss to his lips. "Rest now. We'll talk more when you're stronger." Gabriel's recovery was slow but steady. For the first few days, he was confined to bed, chafing at the inactivity but too weak to do more than sit up for short periods. Lillian spent most of her time with him, reading aloud from her precious books, discussing plans for the ranch, or simply sitting in companionable silence while she mended clothes and he dozed. As his strength returned, so did his determination to salvage the ranch's finances. Unable to make the trip to Fort Shaw himself, he sent Frank with letters of introduction and detailed information about the horses they could provide. The waiting was difficult, but Gabriel filled the time by working on plans to rebuild the barn and reorganize the ranch operations for greater efficiency. 10 days after the attack, Frank returned with news that lifted everyone's spirits. The fort's quartermaster had agreed to purchase 20 horses immediately, with the possibility of a larger contract in the spring if the animals proved satisfactory. The payment would be enough to cover the most pressing debts and begin rebuilding the barn. That evening, Gabriel insisted on joining everyone at the supper table for the first time since his injury. Leaning on a cane and moving slowly, he made his way to the head of the table, where he raised a glass in a toast to Frank's successful mission and to the future of the Double R. Later, he asked Lillian to join him on the porch. The night was cool but clear, with a canopy of stars stretching across the vast Montana sky. They sat side by side on the bench, Gabriel's arm around Lillian's shoulders, her head resting against him. "I've been thinking about the future," he said after a comfortable silence. "My future." "Our future, if you're willing." Lillian's heart quickened. "I'm listening." Gabriel shifted to face her more directly. "I know this isn't the most romantic setting and I'm not at my best," he gestured ruefully at his still healing injuries, "but I can't wait any longer to ask." He took her hands in his. "Lillian Hayes, will you marry me? Will you stay here at the Double R, not as a guest or a helper, but as my wife and partner in everything?" Joy bloomed in Lillian's chest, so intense it was almost painful. "Yes," she answered without hesitation. "Yes, I will marry you, Gabriel Reed." His smile was radiant as he pulled her into a gentle embrace, mindful of his healing ribs. "I don't have a ring yet," he murmured against her hair, "but I promise to get you one as soon as I can ride to town." "I don't need a ring," Lillian assured him, drawing back to look into his face. "I just need you and this place and the life we'll build together." Gabriel kissed her then, a kiss full of promise and devotion. When they parted, he kept her close, his expression turning more serious. "There's something else we should discuss. Blackwood won't give up easily. The attack and the fire were just his opening moves. He's used to getting what he wants." "We'll face him together," Lillian said firmly. "The Double R is our home, and we won't let him take it from us." The determination in her voice brought a proud smile to Gabriel's face. "My brave Lillian," he said softly. "When I found you in the grass that day, I never imagined what a treasure I was discovering. The weeks that followed were filled with hard work and planning. The Army contract provided much-needed funds, and the rebuilding of the barn began in earnest." Gabriel's strength returned gradually, allowing him to take an increasingly active role in the ranch operations, though Lillian insisted he not overtax himself. Their engagement was celebrated with a small gathering at the ranch, attended by the Hands and a few neighbors. Nancy baked a special cake for the occasion, and Frank surprised everyone by producing a bottle of fine whiskey he had been saving for a worthy event. As autumn approached, bringing cooler days and the first hint of color to the cottonwood leaves, Gabriel and Lillian rode to Helena to purchase supplies for the winter and to select a ring from the jeweler's shop. The simple gold band with a small diamond suited Lillian perfectly, elegant but practical, like the woman herself. While in town, they also visited the lawyer's office to discuss their concerns about Blackwood's tactics. The lawyer, a shrewd older man named Phillips, listened carefully to their account of the fire and Gabriel's abduction. "Blackwood's company has a reputation for aggressive expansion," Phillips confirmed, "but they're careful to maintain plausible deniability. Without direct evidence linking him to these incidents, it's difficult to pursue legal action." "So we just wait for him to try again?" Gabriel asked, frustration evident in his voice. Phillips leaned forward, his expression thoughtful. "Not necessarily. Sometimes the best defense is a good offense. Blackwood wants your land because it controls access to the northern grazing territories and the water rights for that whole section. What if you were to form an alliance with the other small ranchers in the area? Together, you might have enough leverage to keep Blackwood at bay." The idea took root, and by the time they left Helena, Gabriel had a list of neighboring ranchers to approach about forming a cooperative association. The plan energized him, giving him a new purpose beyond mere survival. Their wedding was set for late October, after the fall roundup was complete. Lillian threw herself into preparations, with Nancy's enthusiastic assistance. The ceremony would be held at the ranch, with the local minister riding out to officiate. Lillian wrote to her former teacher from Helena, the only person from her old life she wished to include in her new beginning, inviting the woman to attend. 2 weeks before the wedding, Lillian was in the kitchen with Nancy, discussing the menu for the celebration, when they heard riders approaching. Gabriel was out checking the northern boundary with several Hands, not expected back until evening. Nancy peered out the window, her expression darkening. "It's Blackwood," she said grimly, "and he's brought company." Lillian moved to stand beside her. Through the glass, she could see 5 riders dismounting in the yard, Blackwood in his fine Eastern clothes, and 4 rough-looking men who were clearly hired muscle rather than businessmen. "Should we send someone for Gabriel?" Lillian asked, her hand instinctively going to the small revolver Gabriel had insisted she learn to use after his attack. Nancy shook her head. "No time. They're already here." She straightened her apron with determined hands. "We'll handle this ourselves. You're going to be the mistress of this ranch soon enough, might as well start now." Blackwood's knock was unnecessarily loud, an announcement of presence rather than a request for entry. Nancy opened the door with Lillian standing just behind her. "Mr. Blackwood," Nancy said coolly. "Mr. Reed isn't here at present. Blackwood smiled, but the expression didn't reach his eyes. Actually, Mrs. Donovan, I've come to speak with Miss Hayes. May I come in? Nancy hesitated, but Lillian stepped forward. You may speak with me on the porch, Mr. Blackwood. Alone. She met his surprised gaze steadily, then turned to Nancy. It's all right. I'll call if I need anything. Reluctantly, Nancy withdrew, leaving Lillian facing Blackwood across the threshold. He gestured to the porch chairs, and after a moment's consideration, Lillian stepped outside, closing the door behind her. She remained standing, however, unwilling to invite him to sit. What can I do for you, Mr. Blackwood? She asked directly. He studied her with newfound interest. You're not what I expected, Miss Hayes. From what I'd heard, you were a refugee, a charity case Reed had taken in. Lillian lifted her chin. I am engaged to marry Mr. Reed, as I believe you know. Any business concerning the double R concerns me as well. Precisely why I'm here. Blackwood removed his hat, revealing thinning hair slicked back with pomade. I understand congratulations are in order. Marriage is a significant step, one that requires security. He emphasized the last word meaningfully. I wonder if you've considered what kind of future Reed can offer you. A very good one, Lillian replied evenly. The double R is prosperous and growing. Blackwood's smile turned condescending. Is it? The bank in Helena might disagree. Reed's loan payments are barely being met, and one bad winter could put him under. And then there are the accidents, fires, injuries. Montana can be a dangerous place for stubborn people. Anger flared in Lillian, hot and fierce. Are you threatening us, Mr. Blackwood? Not at all. I'm offering a solution. He reached into his coat and withdrew an envelope. My final offer for the ranch, twice what it was worth before Reed's mishap. Enough for you both to start fresh somewhere else, somewhere safer. He held out the envelope. Take it. Consider it a wedding gift. Lillian made no move to accept the envelope. Mr. Blackwood, let me be clear. The double R is not for sale, not to you, not to your company, not to anyone. Furthermore, she stepped closer, lowering her voice, if any more accidents occur on this property or to anyone associated with it, we will know exactly who is responsible, and we will respond accordingly. Blackwood's face hardened. You're making a mistake, Miss Hayes. A woman in your position should be more practical. A woman in my position, Lillian replied, stands by the man she loves and defends what is hers. Good day, Mr. Blackwood. She turned to go back inside. This isn't over, Blackwood called after her. Reed will regret his stubbornness, and so will you. Lillian paused at the door, looking back at him with calm determination. No, Mr. Blackwood, it is over. The double R will never be yours. I suggest you accept that and move on. She entered the house and closed the door firmly behind her, then stood for a moment, her heart racing with a mixture of fear and exhilaration. Nancy hurried from the kitchen, her face anxious. What did he want? What did you tell him? Lillian took a deep breath, steadying herself. I told him to leave and never come back. I don't think he liked it much. Nancy's eyes widened. Lord have mercy, girl. Those men with him look like they eat nails for breakfast. When Gabe hears about this, when I hear about what? Gabriel's voice came from the back door as he entered, earlier than expected. He took in Lillian's flushed face and Nancy's worried expression. What's happened? Before either woman could answer, the sound of horses riding away drew Gabriel to the front window. He caught a glimpse of the departing riders and turned back, his face darkening with anger. Blackwood was here. What did he want? Lillian moved to his side, placing a calming hand on his arm. He came to make one final offer for the ranch. I declined on our behalf. Gabriel stared at her, momentarily speechless. You declined? Yes. Lillian met his gaze steadily. I told him the double R is not for sale and never will be. I also suggested he should accept that fact and move on with his life. For a moment, Gabriel continued to stare at her. Then, unexpectedly, he began to laugh, a deep, genuine laugh that transformed his face. "I wish I could have seen his face," he said when he could speak again. He pulled Lillian into a gentle embrace. "My brave, incredible Lillian." Most men would be furious that their fiancée had handled such a situation. "I find I'm just proud." Lillian relaxed against him, relieved by his reaction. "He threatened us, Gabriel. Implied there would be more accidents." Gabriel's expression sobered. "I expected as much. But I've been making progress with the neighboring ranchers. 6 have agreed to join our association so far. Together, we'll be stronger than Blackwood's company." "And in the meantime?" Lillian asked. "In the meantime," Gabriel said firmly, "we'll be vigilant. Double the night watch. Keep the men armed, prepare for trouble. But we will not live in fear, and we will certainly not let Blackwood prevent us from celebrating our wedding." The day of the wedding dawned clear and cool, with a crispness to the air that hinted at the winter to come. In the 2 weeks since Blackwood's visit, there had been no further incidents, no fires, no attacks, no threats. Whether the land association had given him pause, or he was simply biding his time, no one could say, but the respite was welcome. Lillian stood at the window of her room, watching the ranch come to life in the early morning light. Today was the day she would become Mrs. Gabriel Reed, mistress of the Double R Ranch, wife to the man who had offered her refuge when she needed it most, and had come to represent everything good and true in her world. A knock at the door announced Nancy, carrying a tray with tea and toast. "Can't have you fainting at the altar from hunger," the older woman said cheerfully. She set down the tray and studied Lillian with motherly pride. "You look radiant already, and we haven't even started getting you ready." Lillian smiled, suddenly shy. "I can hardly believe this day is finally here." "Believe it," Nancy said firmly. "You and Gabe were meant for each other. Anyone with eyes can see that. Now eat your breakfast while I lay out your dress." The dress had been a gift from Gabriel's sister, who had been unable to attend the wedding but had sent the beautiful cream-colored gown from St. Louis. It was simpler than the elaborate fashions popular in the East, but made of fine material, with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. With it came a note. "Welcome to the family, sister. I look forward to meeting you when we visit next spring." The morning passed in a blur of preparations. Mrs. Miller, Lillian's former teacher, arrived early to help with her hair, arranging it in an elegant style adorned with small white flowers from Nancy's garden. Frank's wife brought a lace veil she had worn at her own wedding 30 years earlier, offering it as something borrowed. By noon, everything was ready. The ranch hands had transformed the main room of the house, moving furniture to create space for the ceremony. Chairs borrowed from neighbors lined both sides of a central aisle, and autumn flowers decorated every available surface. The minister arrived from town, and guests began to gather, neighboring ranchers and their families, the hands in their Sunday best, a few townspeople who had known Gabriel for years. Gabriel himself was sequestered in the bunkhouse with Frank, tradition dictating that he not see his bride until the ceremony. When at last Nancy came to tell Lillian it was time, she found the young woman standing before the small mirror in her room, a picture of nervous anticipation. "You look beautiful," Nancy said, tears welling in her eyes. "Like an angel." Lillian turned to the woman who had become like a mother to her. "Thank you, Nancy, for everything, for making me feel welcome here, for your guidance, for—" She gestured helplessly, unable to express the depth of her gratitude. Nancy embraced her carefully, mindful of the dress. "You don't need to thank me, child. Having you here has been a blessing. You brought life back to this house and joy back to Gabe." She stepped back, wiping away a tear. "Now, let's not keep that young man waiting any longer. He'll be thinking you've changed your mind." Frank was waiting at the door to escort Lillian down the aisle, having offered to stand in for her father. The old foreman looked surprisingly dapper in his dark suit, his gray hair slicked back, his weathered face softened with emotion as he saw her. "Miss Hayes," he said formally, offering his arm, "it would be my honor to give you away today." Lillian took his arm, her heart full. "The honor is mine, Frank." The simple notes of a fiddle announced the start of the ceremony. As Lillian entered the main room on Frank's arm, the assembled guests rose to their feet. But Lillian had eyes only for Gabriel, standing tall and handsome at the far end of the room, his face illuminated with love as he watched her approach. The vows were traditional, spoken with clear voices that carried to every corner of the room. When Gabriel slid the gold band onto Lillian's finger, his hands were steady, his eyes never leaving hers. And when the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was both tender and passionate, a promise of the life they would build together. The celebration that followed lasted well into the evening. Tables laden with food were set up in the yard, lanterns were hung from trees, and music filled the air as people ate, drank, and danced under the stars. Lillian moved from guest to guest on Gabriel's arm, accepting congratulations and well wishes, feeling a sense of belonging she had never known before. As the night grew late and the guests began to depart, Gabriel led Lillian away from the festivities toward a path lit by lanterns. "I have something to show you," he said mysteriously. The path led to the small cabin that had been the original Reed family home before the larger ranch house was built. Lillian had seen it before a sturdy structure that had fallen into disuse, serving mainly for storage in recent years. But as they approached, Lillian saw that the cabin had been transformed. Light glowed warmly from clean windows, and smoke curled from the stone chimney. Gabriel opened the door with a flourish, revealing a cozy interior that had been completely renovated: new furniture, fresh paint, a fire crackling in the hearth. "Welcome home, Mrs. Reed," Gabriel said softly. "I thought we might want a place of our own, at least for a while. The main house will always be there when we're ready for it, but this—" he gestured around the cabin, "this is just for us." Lillian stepped inside, overwhelmed by the thought and care evident in every detail. A bookshelf held her precious volumes alongside Gabriel's own collection. The quilt on the bed had been made by Nancy, incorporating fabrics from both their pasts. Fresh flowers stood in a vase on the table, and a painting of the Montana landscape hung above the fireplace. "It's perfect," she whispered, turning to embrace her husband. "Absolutely perfect." Gabriel lifted her into his arms, carrying her across the threshold in the traditional manner, then kicking the door closed behind them. As he set her down gently in the center of what was now their home, his eyes held a mixture of love, desire, and profound gratitude. "I never thought I would find someone like you," he said, his voice husky with emotion. "Someone who would see this hard, wild country and love it as I do. Someone who would stand beside me against whatever comes, who would see the value in what I'm trying to build here." Lillian reached up to touch his face, tracing the strong line of his jaw. "And I never thought I would find someone who would look at me and see not a burden, but a partner. Someone who would say you belong here and make me believe it was true." Gabriel caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "It is true. You belong here, Lillian Reed, with me, always." Their kiss was a seal on that promise, the beginning of a night of tender discovery, and the first chapter of a life together that would face its share of challenges, but would be built on the strongest of foundations: mutual respect. shared purpose, and a love that had bloomed against all odds in the wild heart of Montana. The years that followed were not without their trials. Blackwood made one final attempt to force the sale of the Double R, hiring men to divert the creek that provided water to the ranch's southern pastures. But the newly formed Ranchers Association responded with a unified front, threatening legal action and presenting evidence of tampering that even Blackwood's influence couldn't overcome. Faced with the prospect of criminal charges, he finally abandoned his pursuit of the land, turning his company's attention to easier targets further east. The Double R flourished under Gabriel and Lillian's joint stewardship. The Army contract expanded, making their horse breeding operation as profitable as the cattle. Gabriel's innovative approaches to ranching, some learned from books Lillian ordered from back east, others developed through their own experimentation, earned the respect of neighbors and competitors alike. Nancy stayed on, overseeing the household with her usual efficiency, though she gradually relinquished more responsibilities to Lillian as the years passed. Frank remained foreman until rheumatism forced him to take a less physically demanding role, at which point he became the ranch's bookkeeper, bringing order to the financial records that had previously been Gabriel's least favorite task. In the spring of their second year of marriage, Lillian gave birth to a daughter they named Rose, after Gabriel's mother. 2 years later came a son, Thomas, named for Lillian's father. The children grew strong and healthy in the clean Montana air, learning to ride almost as soon as they could walk, absorbing their parents' love for the land and all it represented. The small cabin where they had begun their married life eventually became Rose's special retreat, a place for reading and dreaming when the main house grew too busy. The family moved back to the ranch house when Thomas was born, needing the additional space, but the cabin remained a symbol of their beginnings, carefully maintained and frequently visited. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Gabriel surprised Lillian with a special gift, a small printing press, and all the equipment needed to establish a modest newspaper. He had noticed her writing in journals over the years, recording the daily life of the ranch and the larger events of the territory with equal attention to detail and insight. "Montana will be a state soon," he told her as she stood speechless before the press. "It needs voices to tell its stories, to shape its future. Your voice should be one of them." With characteristic determination, Lillian taught herself the art of typesetting and printing. The Double R Gazette began as a monthly publication distributed to neighboring ranches and the nearest towns. Within 3 years, it had grown to a weekly newspaper with subscribers throughout the territory, known for its fair reporting, thoughtful editorials, and Lillian's popular column on frontier life. Through the paper, Lillian was able to advocate for causes dear to her heart: education for ranch children, voting rights for women, fair treatment of the native tribes who had been pushed from their traditional lands. Gabriel supported her work wholeheartedly, proud of the respect she earned both locally and beyond. Their partnership deepened with each passing year, weathering the inevitable storms of life: droughts that threatened the herds, harsh winters that tested their resources, the normal tensions that arise between two strong-willed people sharing a life and a business. But the foundation they had built proved sturdy, their love growing stronger rather than diminishing with time and familiarity. On a clear autumn evening much like the one when they had first met, 20 years after Lillian had stumbled exhausted onto Double R land, she and Gabriel stood together on the rise overlooking the ranch. The property had expanded significantly over the decades, now encompassing twice the acreage it had when Gabriel inherited it. The buildings below were well-maintained and prosperous-looking, with the addition of a schoolhouse for the ranch children and a bunkhouse, twice the size of the original. Gabriel's hair was threaded with silver now, and fine lines marked the corners of his eyes. Lillian's own brown hair showed strands of gray, and her hands bore the marks of years of work. But as they stood arm in arm, watching their 18-year-old daughter ride expertly across the pasture to round up a stray calf, with their 16-year-old son following close behind, they felt only gratitude for the life they had built together. "You ever regret it?" Gabriel asked suddenly. "Coming here, staying here. You could have had a different life, perhaps an easier one." Lillian looked up at him, surprised by the question after so many years. "Never," she said firmly. "Not for a single moment. This is where I was meant to be, with you building this." She gestured toward the ranch spread out before them. "This is home." Gabriel smiled, the same smile that had won her heart 2 decades earlier. "You know," he said thoughtfully, "I've been thinking about what to do with that north section we acquired last year. Rose has her heart set on expanding the horse breeding program, and she has good ideas. Maybe it's time to let her take more responsibility." "She's ready," Lillian agreed. "She has your instincts and determination." "And your intelligence and compassion," Gabriel added. "Thomas, too, shows promise with the cattle operation. In a few years, they could be running most of the day-to-day business." Lillian raised an eyebrow. "Are you suggesting retirement, Mr. Reed?" Gabriel chuckled. "Not exactly, but perhaps a step back. We've worked hard for 20 years. I thought maybe we might travel a bit, visit your teacher in Denver, see my sister in St. Louis, maybe even go east to see the ocean." "The famous Gabriel Reed, leaving his beloved ranch for the big city," Lillian teased. "I never thought I'd see the day." He pulled her closer against the cooling evening air. "Well, a man can change. Besides, we'd always come back. This is our place in the world." "Yes," Lillian said softly, leaning into his embrace. "It is." As the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson, they stood together in comfortable silence, watching their children bring the stray calf back to the herd. Below them, lights began to appear in the windows of the ranch house as Nancy prepared the evening meal. The sounds of the day's work winding down drifted up to them, men's voices, the lowing of cattle, a dog barking. It was the symphony of the life they had created together, a life that had begun when a desperate young woman had run from a place where she was called a burden and found a man who told her, simply and truly, "You belong here." And she did.